Interlude: How the Naboo Crisis Changed the Galaxy. == One of the most important events that set up the stage for the Clone Wars is often either overlooked or examined for the obvious consequences: Sheev Palpatine being elected as the new Chancellor and the Trade Federation facing investigations along with heavy fines. While those events are undoubtedly important, others equally vital political and military changes are often dismissed, especially in the core worlds. That's understandable. Most of the events we'll be looking at happened on the Outer Rim or in the colonies in the expansion region, and to a much lesser extent in the Inner Rim. Most of those changes didn't really affect the core worlds, with Corellia and Fondor being two notable exceptions. They would see a lot of business coming their way in the years leading to the formal formation of the SIS and the Clone Wars. When examining the facts logically, what happened isn't a huge surprise to anyone. Or at least it shouldn't be. The whole galaxy saw a Republic member world be invaded by a megacorporation that had a representative in the Senate in its own right. It watched as the Republic government was tied up in legalities and procedures. Instead of dispatching aid to their occupied member world, the Senate chose to begin an investigation, to create a committee to examine the situation. We all know the outcome. Naboo wasn't liberated by a Republic naval fleet. It had to fight on its own, and only the aid of a pair of Jedi and a simply unreal amount of luck combined with a flaw in Trade Federation doctrine allowed them victory. The Senate acted only after the situation was resolved. Many believed that the consequences for the Trade Federation were little more than a slap on the wrist given the gravity of their actions. Yet that was enough to eventually drive them to become one of the founding members of the Confederacy. All of the above is public knowledge that can be easily found in the Holonet. The consequences of those events are harder to trace, so a person can build a complete picture for themselves. The galaxy saw the invasion of Naboo. Saw that peaceful world be abandoned by the Republic. It saw that only military action executed by the Naboo people led to their liberation. Thousands of systems concluded that the only way to guarantee their security was to either build up sufficiently powerful armed forces from scratch or to significantly upgrade and expand their existing ones. Soon the demand for military hardware outpaced the supply. Production all over the Mid and Outer Rim expanded, and even Corellia and Fondor were contracted to build more ships. In 10 years that military build-up would see the worlds disillusioned, with the Republic joining the expanding Confederacy one after another along with their military forces. Fondor, which had become a huge arsenal supplying the colonies with all they needed, would soon choose to become a part of the SIS and thus provide a large increase in industrial potential for the young alliance. The political implications of the invasion of Naboo for the galaxy are in fact more important than the military ones. They in fact created an environment where the latter became all but inevitable. Arguably, it was the Republic's impotency during the Naboo crisis that made the creation of the SIS possible. It enabled the Confederacy's unexpected growth. Thousands of systems joined the SIS after losing faith in the Republic's ability and, more importantly, willingness to protect them, which has always been one of the large benefits of becoming a member world. That was especially true for the worlds one the Outer Rim, where the economic benefits of being a part of the Republic were quite small in comparison to the benefits reaped by the core and Inner Rim systems. The same environment, if to a lesser extent, existed in the expansion region. Extract from History of the Clone Wars, Volume 1, The Calm Before the Storm. Published by Anax's Military Academy. == Phase 34, The Confederacy Strikes Back. Part 6. == Mandalorian Military HQ. Location classified. The place was so new that it still smelled of fresh paint, plastic and metal from recently installed equipment. There had been no time to put any decorations besides a flag with the symbol of Mandalore which covered one of the walls in the briefing room. The people who for all intents and purposes were the government were gathered inside discussing the impending Confederate attack and their readiness to receive it. We have confirmation that a powerful separatist force left Findor 36 hours ago. They should be here before noon tomorrow. Captain Trek informed the men in charge of Mandalore. We're as ready as we can be, General Scarter said. The shield generators and power distribution network are a fortresses defended by 2 Republic armored divisions, a clone infantry division and 1st Army Group. Second is spread among the major cities and industrial centers and backed up by every warrior on the planet not part of the army. The man running things in Mandalorian space while Mandalore was away reported, "We've got enough shelter for the civilian population to keep most of our people safe at every major population center. My people are confident that we've rooted out the majority of Death Watch true believers who are left. However, we're equally sure that the Confederacy still has at least a few agents planet-side they can contact for intelligence or simply buy. We're working on finding them all and plugging up any leaks we can find. The Protectors are back to 70% of authorized strength. With volunteers going primary to the Army and Navy, I'm not confident we'll be able to do a job properly everywhere. I might need to request aid from MP units in certain areas depending on how things shape in the future. Ordo reported. That covers the ground side affairs. Admiral Palion? Scarter asked. My fleet is ready and the devices provided by General Vale are operational. I've chosen to assume a defensive posture and depending on the enemy fleet composition and the effect the devices have on them I'll either counterattack or fall under the planetary shield. While some people might disagree, we're aware of the strategic situation. It will be 6 to 8 months before our light naval units are complete and between 12 to 16 for the capital ships, if you can keep the shipyards intact, Yomaget said. With no Republic reinforcements expected for at least 2 to 4 months, we would be glad if you can keep your fleet intact and the orbitals reasonably secure until that changes, Admiral Palion. That's what I intend. Gilad nodded. If that's all, I need to get back to the fleet. Victory and glory, Admiral, Scarter said as goodbye. Same to you boys and girls, General. Palion saluted and headed to the hangars with Captain Trek on his heels. When they left, the Mandalorians continued their discussions. We'll need to properly present the situation to our more volatile members. Branagh began. Some of our warriors, especially those who came back, won't like a defensive posture or the fact that we're dependent on the Republic for a navy. I don't like it either even if they've been on the level so far. Ordo added. While I agree, we can't make ships appear from thin air. We'll need the Republic for at least the next 2 years. Yomaget shrugged. How is incorporating the sector going? Ord asked. We can use the additional manpower and industry. The Duchess has been in talks with their senators and ambassadors on Coruscant and we've sent delegations to the most important planets. Those with large Mandalorian population are pleased by our offer, however others don't want to hear anything about falling under our influence. What about our detractors at Coruscant? From what I hear, the Cathar are baying for our blood. Branagh inquired. They're a problem. Unfortunately Sylvaris actually has the full backing of her government. The last thing they want to see is us getting stronger. Horus answered. Dealing with diplomacy was a fourth hat he had to wear while that service was being restored after the attack and cleaned up from pacifists who might be against the resurgence of Mandalorian militarism. That might get unpleasant. Sylvaris and her cronies already managed to slow down certain equipment and technological transfers for the army. Ord grumbled. The same is true for industrial equipment to speed up our shipbuilding. Yomaget added. I'm pretty sure Mandalore has plans for dealing with that nuisance. Unfortunately for the time being he's cut off from the centers of Republic power. At least he took care of Crimson, Scarter said. He had seen the uncensored reports from Atrisia, the Gar's preliminary conclusions of how dangerous that thing was and his own theories aligned with them. There were a lot of quiet murmurs of agreement. The one thing that either pissed off some people or got Vale more support from others was the fact that he didn't take a single proper Mandalorian warrior with him to deal with Crimson, which also meant that none were lost when the units sent to take out the planetary shields were sacrificed in the orbital bombardment. =Arche equals CIC, Mandalorian Cruiser Avenger. High orbit above Mandalore. When the Confederacy fleet arrived, Palion and his people were waiting for them. Trek's reports were right, the enemy did bring a stronger force to eliminate Mandalore. While the enemy fleet that exited hyperspace flight light seconds from the planet was smaller than the one Grievous brought, this one had significantly more firepower thanks to the 12 Criffing battleships it brought. Gilad frowned. In a stand-up fight he might be able to take out all the munificence and about a third of the Lucca hulks, but that would see his fleet gutted. He simply would be unable to reduce the incoming enemy firepower fast enough to win. The Admiral smiled coldly. It was too bad he wasn't planning on a proper conventional battle. 8 Fleet, we're going with Blue 2. Calculate hyperspace insertion coordinates and jump at my mark. Palion ordered. Captain, I hope for all our sakes that the silencer works as advertised, Gilad whispered quiet enough that only Trek heard him. Me too, sir. The plan is solid and it should come as a complete surprise. After all, attacking the separatists with the forces we have is going to play in their favor. The captain smirked. Or so they'll believe. Pallion nodded. He closed his eyes and ran some mental calculation. If he criffed up, his fleet might get either mauled or leave the enemy between them and the planet and thus let them land troop. Which, when he thought about it, wasn't as big a problem as it would be at most other worlds. The Admiral banked on the silencer's reveal and sheer shock impact to buy time and reduce the enemy numbers. Calculations complete. The fleet is ready to jump. Fire Plan Beta 3. Ignore the battleships and concentrate on the enemy frigates. Pallion paused so his orders could be transmitted. Execute. Now it was time to put the silencer to the test. Part 7. RK Bridge. Systroid Command Ship Murderous Intent. 5 light seconds from Mandalore. While 5th Fleet finished its real space transition and assumed a proper offensive formation, its commander ordered fighter wings to begin sweeping the system for any additional enemy forces. TF-1726 was the droid in charge. He was the first of Confederate super tactical droids to receive a significant upgrade, which meant a more robust body, much fewer constraints upon his programming and significantly expanded processing capabilities. All that explained why he preferred to be called by his chosen name, Commander Kraken, instead of the dull factory-placed designation he wore. The super tactical droid had distinguishing himself by defeating the Republic forces at Quell shortly before the Second Battle for Geonosis. That victory earned Kraken the privilege of getting the upgrades first, as well as a place in command of the fleet sent to remove the Mandalorian problem once and for all. TF-1726 took a long look at the sensor readings after his ship exited hyperspace and began crunching numbers. The result of any engagement should have been obvious. The CIS battleships made all the difference, and if commanded competently there was no way that he could lose. Math didn't lie after all. As a consequence, Kraken was taken aback when the whole Republic fleet advanced until they were out of Mandalore's gravity well before entering hyperspace. He had mere moments to ponder the strange enemy behavior before the whole 8th Fleet came back on his right flank. Kraken tilted its head to the side in exasperation. If the Republic commander wanted a battle in open space, he was ready to oblige them. TF-3, engage the enemy. All TFs launch fighters. TF-1, move to flank. TF-2, move to encircle using a hyperspace jump. TF-1726 ordered. The enemy had a short-lived advantage in numbers and firepower at the point of contact that resulted in 6 munificents dying in a short order in exchange of a heavily damaged light cruiser and a pair of CR-90s. The force Kraken personally commanded, TF-1, moved past TF-3 to flank the enemy, and already thousands of vultures were flying towards the Republic fleet. The tactical plot flashed red and the super battle droid simply stared in incomprehension. 27 munificents simply vanished from the sensors. The system initially logged it as a glitch and began self-diagnostic. Report, Kraken snapped. The Republic deployed a new weapon. Multiple beams of red light came from 2 of their ships and we lost more than half of our frigates. The tactical droid in charge of TF-3 was beginning to panic. Target those ships. Fire everything. Kraken ordered. Redline the engines, we need to enter range faster. For 2 minutes 5th Fleet's 3rd Task Force threw itself against the Republic 8th Fleet. They lost most of their remaining frigates in the process and the enemy was practically engulfed by a firestorm made of dying fighters. TF-1 was about to enter range when the Republic ships charged against the battle group they have been engaging since the beginning. Kraken had opened a feed to his ship's optical sensors and he managed to see exactly what happened. TF-3's remaining frigates vanished in massive explosions when crimson bolts came from the center of the enemy formation. Then one of the battleships was given the same treatment. The Lacquer Hulks was protected by massive shields backed up by a lot of armor. Those defenses actually made a difference and the behemoth survived. However, it was far from intact. Its shields were drained and pierced in multiple places, which resulted in wrecked sensor clusters and weapon emplacements. The whole 5th Fleet flew past it while unleashing every gun that could bear upon the battleship. They didn't stop either but continued to open the range and began vanishing in hyperspace the moment their hyperdrives recovered. Unfortunately, none of Kraken's ships could get into proper vectors to plot an intercept. The losses were appalling. 50 munificents destroyed, One battleship battered into a wreck and another with moderate damage, along with more than 10,000 fighters lost, a significant part before or while launching. The Fifth Fleet managed to take out a single Venator, 6 light cruisers and 20 enemy frigates along with unknown number of Republic fighters. There were reports of damage inflicted upon the enemy capital ships, however Kraken wouldn't know for sure until all the sensor logs could be examined. The super tactical droids forced its processors into overclock. At worst it had a few minutes to get its force into position to counter another Republic attack. At best that was it and the enemy was retreating, however such an outcome wasn't something Kraken could count on. The problem was those 2 unknown weapons. They were too dangerous and had to be eliminated, else the enemy would be able to pull another 2 or 3 such attacks before they lost too many ships. While Fifth Fleet could survive such losses, it wasn't something that Kraken found acceptable after his upgrades and updates. He needed the enemy to come to him and stand to fight. Solving that equation was simple. All ships form up on TF-1 and execute a hyperspace insertion on the edge of Mandalore's gravity well. All ground units prepare for deployment. The Confederacy strikes back. RK equals. Part 8. RK equals. CIC, Mandalorian Cruiser Avenger. 20 light seconds from Mandalore. I need to know the status of the fleet. Palion ordered. We're working on it, sir. We've lost 1 Venator, offensive at dawn. 6 light cruisers and... The staff lieutenant paused. We've got only 16 frigates on sensors. 20 CR-90 are presumed lost. Damage reports are still coming in. Those battleships made a number on us. Trek grumbled. At point-blank range. The captain shook his head. I want emergency repairs complete ASAP. The admiral ordered. Give me a status update on the damage the fleet took when you have it, Staff Lieutenant. Comms, I want an update from Mandalore on what the Clanker are doing. Sensors, the same from both the fleet and the sensor platforms in the inner system. Captain, I need to know the status of the silencers. Long can they continue firing at the current rate before something breaks? I'll talk with the engineers. Trek confirmed and went for his comm unit. Palion turned away and called the sensor logs on the main holotank. He needed to re-examine the engagement so he could judge both how effective the silencer was without being distracted by the rest of the battle. A minute later, Gilad was interrupted by a status update. Admiral, the enemy fleet is firming up their formation and continuing towards Mandalore. Keep me apprised of any changes. I want a continuous update of hyperspace insertion coordinates at the back of their formation. Turn the fleet on the appropriate vectors once the damage assessment is complete. Palion ordered and continued studying the engagement. Gilad's initial impression appeared to be correct. The silencer was simply devastating against lightly protected targets like the Munificence. As his test suggested, it was useful to break even battleship defenses. That stunt was the only thing that allowed 8th Fleet to cripple one of the Lugger hulks in such a short engagement. Palion slammed a fist in the armrest of his seat, which conveniently lacked any electronics and was well padded for just such occasions. If he had just 2 more, perhaps 3 silencers, Gilad was confident that he could have won. He was reasonably sure that he could still cripple the enemy fleet if he got lucky and one of the super weapons wasn't taken out by the enemy anytime soon. Once he knew the status of his fleet, he would be able to refine his plans and assumptions. Perhaps if he could keep striking the edges of the enemy formation and getting away before they could properly concentrate their firepower. The Admiral reset the recording and began examining it again. Splitting his force in 2 groups each centered around a silencer might work, however with the way his fleet arrived, in bits and pieces, Gilad knew that he would be unable to keep proper tactical command of both units. The fleet simply didn't have enough time to train as a single unit, so any particular clever maneuvers were simply out of the question. However, there were all those light ships brought by the Mandalorians waiting on the other side of the planet. He could use them. It was going to be very ugly, but it might just work. Sir, I've got the status update. 1 moderately damaged Venator, Midnight Blade. 2 lightly damaged, Praetorian and Coruscant Dawn. 2 moderately damaged Acclimators, Lighting and Majestic. 3 light cruisers in the same state and 1 reporting light damage. The CR-90s fared worse, 5 moderately damaged and 3 lightly damaged. The captains need at least 2 hours to repair important systems easy to fix with shipboard resources. The flag lieutenant reported. Tell them to carry on. We'll be engaging the enemy in 2 hours. Get the on-duty shift take hour and half of downtime, the same goes for the captains. Pallian ordered after digesting the report. It was painful to hear, though not unexpected. There were consequences of engaging multiple battleships and their escorts at point-blank range. Fighter loses? The admiral asked. Still compiling them. Torrents were landing at the closest ships when we jumped. Preliminary estimates are a third of our fighter strength. Can be a bit better or worse. Give me the numbers when you have them. Comms, I need a secure line with Scarter. Use a direct beam through the sensor platforms away from the enemy fleet. RK equals. Staging Area 7-1. Sundari City. Mandalore. All units in the AO, the enemy fleet has broken through. Expect separatist assault within the next 20 minutes. Control's voice came over the comms of the forces dug in and around the capital. Among them was a certain commando unit attached to the only force adept on the planet. You heard command. Lazy time's over. Check your gear and get to the transports. We'll be reinforcing any position that cannot hold. Niner ordered. You know, I almost pity the clankers, Dev chuckled before began checking his grenade launcher. What gave you that idea? Arya snorted. The Sith in training looked over the skyscraper roof where they were stationed. The place used to be a civilian landing pad converted for military use. It was quite large too. It had more than enough space for 10 LATs and a unit of Basilisk war droids, and it was all properly utilized. All of them were a part of the QRF to be dispatched once the primary enemy landing sites and likely targets could be established. I want one of those. Arya whined while watching the 5 war droids stand up after their pilots got on board. Isn't your master making them? Fi asked. Can you just ask for one? I did. Arya grumbled. The first production runs are promised to the Mandalorians. Perhaps I should ask my master to adopt me in his clan so I can get my hands on one faster. The Chiss woman frowned. I want one too. We can all pass for proper Mandalorians, right? Atin asked. Well, General Scarter and his people certainly did their best. Fi stopped checking his sniper after voicing that thought. I wonder if they have long-range fire support variants. Focus people. You can drool over the basilisks after we've dealt with the clankers. Niner shook his head in exasperation. They were commandos, special operations. While those war droids were nice, they weren't exactly fitting with Omega's job description. However, that didn't mean he didn't want to get one for himself. All units in the Sundariao, be advised. The Separatist fleet executed a hyperspace insertion in high orbit. They've begun launching landing craft and fighters. So it begins. Niner noted. Get on board, we'll be deploying soon. He pointed at the waiting transport. RK equals. Sundari airspace. Mandalore. A year of war can be a long time when the leadership of an army is willing to learn. Since the beginning of the conflict, the Confederacy had attacked thousands of worlds and successfully taken a lot of them. They had lost planets too. However, until they experienced a change of leadership, there was no institutional drive to learn from their mistakes. That was left to individual commanders, those who survived after cripping up anyway. Yet the leadership was replaced. Both victories and defeats were examined. The enemy tactics too. Conclusions were made, and finally the Confederate military as a whole began putting in practice the lessons it should have learned months earlier. Turo and Mandalore were among the first places where the Confederate Army was able to demonstrate how they've changed. Of those 2 assaults, the latter was undoubtedly the harder. First, the system wasn't secure. The majority of Admiral Pallian's fleet was still operational and presented moderate to high threat for the Cis Navy in orbit. Second, Mandalore was one of the places in the galaxy which anyone reasonable would have thought twice before invading. The Confederate military did precisely that, and they reached the conclusion that the changes in tactics and doctrine implemented across both the Army and Navy would be sufficient to at least secure a foothold on Mandalore with the forces given to TF-1726. It was at noon Sundari time when that belief was put to the test. The siege of Mandalore began with 10,000 fighters diving through the planetary shield, followed by 1,500 strike craft, thousands of assault ships and hundreds of transport. A not insignificant percentage of those craft were disabled by the energy field protecting the planet. Nearly a fifth of the Vultures and 127 of the strike craft malfunctioned and crashed. Almost 20% of the transports had to make emergency landing where they could, with a lot of them hitting the ground at velocities even their droid crews couldn't survive. Yet, the bulk of the invasion force made it through the first line of defense largely intact. Their first act on entering the atmosphere came from the large transports. They were outfitted with both jammers and missile pods. Suddenly the incoming contacts doubled thanks to Confederacy EO efforts. Thousands of missiles were launched to seek any active sensor platforms they could find. Some were attack birds, however the majority were sophisticated decoys. AA emplacements, proton and laser cannons arose from their hiding places and opened fire at the invaders. Thousands of Mandalorian fighters rose from the surface to meet the incoming Vulture swarm and the skies were set afire. The defenders did their best. Things might have been different if Kraken hadn't chosen to attack the region bombarded by General Grievous months ago. If the Republic had provided more material or financial support, the defense network around the capital might have been better equipped to face the onslaught coming their way. The defenders extracted heavy price from the machines coming to invade their world anyway. However, it was a price that Kraken's army could afford to pay. By the time the last transport hit the ground, either landing on its own or shot down, 2/3 of the Vultures were destroyed, yet the skies were clear from Mandalorian fighters. Only the surviving AA emplacements made sure that Confederate strike craft and assault ships didn't achieve a total aerial superiority. The majority of surviving Vultures pulled up to provide cap and intercept any fighter or bomber flights attempting to enter the region. The assault ships dived at the entrenched defenders on the heels of all remaining strike craft. Blaster fire and missiles crossed in the air seeking their targets. Whole squads were torn apart in their trenches. Unshielded bunkers were blown open by heavy fire. While destroyed ships rained from the sky, assault transport dropped commando units behind the Mandalorian lines. Some of them even survived to pull back to the closest Confederate staging grounds where engineers were busy setting up shield generators and AA of their own. 1 hour after the landings began, Systank columns backed by mechanized infantry and artillery struck the Mandalorian forward defenses around Sundari while commando units were still doing their best to disrupt enemy attempts to reinforce. At the same time, rearmed assault ships headed for the still existing breaches in the dome protecting the capital loaded with fresh droids. The siege of Mandalore had begun. =RK equals CIC, Mandalorian Cruiser Avenger. High orbit above Mandalore. Coordinating the second strike upon the Separatist fleet was anything but easy. The timing had to be perfect, the hyperspace jump executed by 8th Fleet flawless, and they had to minimize the time in contact with the enemy. Doing it all in just a couple of hours was a testament to the skills of General Scarta and Palion's own staffs. Without them, Gilad was sure that his brainstorm would have been impossible. In theory the plan was simple. The Mandalorian light ships would divide in 2 equal groups, then use the planet's gravity well to swing around and strike the Separatist flanks skimming just above the planetary shield. Just as they were getting into range, after the enemy would have time to detect them and react, 8th Fleet would execute a hyperspace jump and engage the Separatist center from below, shoot up as many of the Confederate ships they could, then get out of range as fast as possible. After that, the survivors would regroup, check their status and plan how to make the enemy's life miserable. It was simple in theory. Pulling it off in practice, especially when you consider that most of the Mandalorians crewing the light ships weren't Navy or even experienced shipmasters, much less trained to properly work together, was anything but. In reality, getting all those ships moving in the same direction at the same time was a feat by itself, and all of Scarta's people who made it possible by coordinating things from the ground deserved free drinks for as long as they wanted. When Palion's fleet returned to real space and began targeting the enemy, the Admiral stared intently at the holotank and waited for an update. It took precious seconds for the sensors to process the raw data and feed it into the tactical display. The Admiral frowned at what he saw. In the short time it took to give the order to jump and for the 8th Fleet to comply, the more or less ordered Mandalorian advance had fallen apart. Instead of hitting the Confederacy as 2 large groups, the light ships had spread out. It was unclear if it was just shipmasters seeking glory, their inexperience, or simply some ships being unable to maintain the same speed and direction under the conditions they were flying in due to technical difficulties. It was probably a combination of those factors. It didn't really matter. The leading ships were simply blown to pieces by the munificence on the flanks, which began peeling off to meet the fighters' flew to intercept them too, and each one of those was one less to go after 8th Fleet. The rest of the plan simply didn't work. The Confederate commander refused to be baited and instead kept the formation intact with the exception of the frigates at the edge of its flanks. Even worse, the enemy had put a swarm of weapon platforms in front of its ships and they were covered by the fleet CCM and fighter patrols until 8th Fleet found them the hard way when they unleashed their proton torpedoes. Pallian's leading elements staggered under dozens of hits. He lost most of his remaining frigates and 3 light cruisers before anyone knew what hit them. Locating and targeting the new threat took precious seconds in which the platforms continued to pour fire in his fleet. Even worse, the shift in priorities meant that more of the vultures coming to swarm the fleet were going to get through. However, none of that changed a thing as far as the heavy firepower of 8th Fleet was concerned. After all, fighters and weapon platforms were too small to be effectively targeted by either the turbo laser cannons or the silencer, and those unleashed their fury upon the enemy as planned. 25 munificence vanished when the superweapon spoke, even more shattered under the concentrated fire of 8th Fleet's capital ships. For long seconds the Confederate fleet refused to respond. Then its guns spoke as one and they had just 2 targets, Avenger and Vengeance. It was fortunate that Pallian had planned for such an outcome. The moment after the silencers fired, the hangar doors above the weapons began to close and multiple ships maneuvered to interpose themselves between the cruisers carrying them and the enemy. Meanwhile the Mandalorians reached attack range. A third of their number died getting this far, yet they were finally able to respond. Makeshift weapons bolted to the ragtag fleet spoke in a ragged barrage and scores of concussion missiles and proton torpedoes flew at the Separatist fleet. They were followed by laser, railgun and the odd turbo laser battery shooting for all they were worth. As if that wasn't enough, warriors seeking either glory, redemption or both aimed their ships at the closest Confederate target, redlined the engines and overrode the safeties of their reactors. Only 21 of the Mandalorian ships lived long enough to escape the gravity well and enter hyperspace. However, their sacrifice wasn't in vain. 10 frigates died under their fire or thanks to ramming attacks. 4 more were damaged along with 2 battleships which were struck by kamikazes despite all the Umbrella could do to protect them. Things in the center were mixed bag. Before escaping in hyperspace, 8th Fleet managed to destroy 46 frigates, damage 2 more. More importantly, they gutted another Lucre Hugh. That victory came at a steep price. All escorts but a nearly crippled light cruiser and another moderately damaged were simply annihilated. Another Venator was lost along with an acclamator. Most damning was Vengeance's fate after she utilized her silencer for the 2nd time and before it could be protecting by the closing hangar doors, a pair of Separatist strike craft slipped through everything 8th Fleet could throw their way. They unleashed their loadout of proton torpedoes and followed them through in a suicide attack. Vengeance was crippled by energy feedback sent by the silencer's destruction. While most of the shunts meant to prevent such an event acted as advertised, a handful failed and the resulting chain reaction scrammed the cruiser's hypermatter reactor, feeding the superweapon with energy. Vengeance fell out of formation and Pallian was forced to abandon her or risk the annihilation of his remaining fleet. Siege of Mandalore, naval losses so far. 1. Republicate Fleet and Mandalorian Volunteer Forces. 3 Venators lost, Vengeance, Offensive at Dawn and Midnight Blade, Coruscant Dawn, heavy damage, Avenger, light damage. 1 Acclamator lost, Lighting, Majestic, heavy damage, Echo, moderate damage. 9 light cruisers destroyed, 1 heavy, near crippling damage, 1 moderate damage. 36 CR-90 frigates. 138 Mandalorian volunteer ships, light freighters and corvettes. 2. 5th Confederacy Fleet. 2 Lucka hulks wrecked, 1 moderate damage, 2 light damage. 106 munificence destroyed, 6 moderate to high damage. 33,000 fighters lost, naval and surface action. 2,596 strike craft lost, naval and surface action. 367 weapon platforms lost. RK Interlude, The Liberation of Ryloth. RK It's still argued when the first stage of the Clone Wars ended. Some believe it was after the Confederacy Council executed a successful coup and radically changed the nature of the enemy facing the Republic. However, Some believe that event to be the beginning of the conflict's third stage, a sentiment shared by the authors of this book. It is generally accepted by the Anaxes Military Academy that the first phase of the Clone Wars ended after the raid on Coruscant. That event led to General Delcatar Vale becoming the commander of all combat forces in the Republic. Among his first acts was the tall order of restructuring GAR High Command after it was practically destroyed after an attack on their HQ. That period is notable for the overhaul of the military command structure that saw two-thirds of the Jedi who were in practice running the war effort be either demoted or removed from command positions. Many exchanged the command of whole armies with that of battalions, companies or even platoons. Others were attached to commando strike teams and not always put in charge. This change was one of the most visible and effective ones implemented by the general and his supporters. The first major operation carried by the Republic military under Vale's command was the liberation of Ryloth. Even today, the strategic feasibility liberating the Twi'lek homeworld is questioned, though even its biggest detractors agree that the Republic was bound to act by the political realities of the time, not to mention the moral imperative to do something about the enslavement of a whole Republic world. It wasn't before the battle was concluded and intelligence gathered on the ground examined, that it became clear that Ryloth had been conceived as a trap by certain elements of the Confederate military. Whole droid armies along with significant numbers of heavy proton artillery capable of damaging Acclamator assault ships in the atmosphere had been deployed by the Separatists. The Confederacy Navy was present in strength too, along with a large contingent of ships under Hutt flag sent to collect the first batch of slaves promised to them by Wat Tambor, the leader of the Techno-Union. It wasn't until years later before the particulars of the deal he cut with the Hutt became clear. The space battle above Ryloth was notable for two things. First was the successful implementation of novel and unorthodox tactics by General Vale, many of which became standard later in the conflict. The other change had equally strong impact, the introduction of the first iteration of the Guardian system, which in less than a year would make the deployment of standard starfighters and bombers a losing proposition. However, that stage wouldn't be reached until after the third phase of the Clone Wars was concluded with the end of Operation Deep Strike aimed at the ground component of the liberation was notable for a number of reasons. The most notable among them is a major change in the rows employed by Republic forces when assaulting a planet, though it wouldn't be until months later during Second Geonosis that the full effects would become obvious. After the infantry assault on Cis artillery positions protected from orbital bombardments by Ryloth citizens captured by the Confederacy achieved moderate success, General Vale called Iron Strike from the fleet in orbit. The bombardment was nominally successful. It resulted in the destruction of the Cis proton artillery, preventing the GAR landing in numbers. However, it was carried out while the army units who failed to achieve their objectives were still in the affected area along with all the hostages at those separatist positions. After effects from the massive energy released by the bombardment caused the death or severe injury of multiple civilians and GAR personnel, including Jedi General Obi-Wan Kenobi. It was only during Second Geonosis that it became clear to everyone that the GAR no longer was restrained by fear of causing heavy collateral damage and civilian casualties when taking out military installations or such with dual use through orbital bombardment. While controversial, such tactics met universal approval among the clone army and more limited one among regular personnel. It is notable that any attempt of changing back the GAROs to what they were before the raid on Coruscant by elements within the Republic Senate were blocked by the military and political consequences of the liberation of Ryloth cannot be overstated. That victory represented one of the biggest setbacks for the Confederacy during the second stage of the Clone Wars, and it's understandable why some historians note it as the beginning of that period of the conflict. One of the biggest effects of the GAR victory is often overlooked. Prior to Ryloth, the Confederate droid armies were universally outfitted with switch-off codes possessed by the highest-ranking Separatists' leaders. Thus the capture of Wat Tambor and his agreement to hand over his personal codes were vital for the liberation of Ryloth. Instead of fighting through massive droid armies, the GAR won by simply switching them out. It's still unclear when the switch-off codes were universally removed from the Confederate armies. What we know for certain is that shortly after the Confederate Council seized power, the CIS no longer produced droids which could be turned off with a mere signal. Undoubtedly that was one of the major events making possible there. Another major consequence of the Confederate defeat at Ryloth was that their military leadership at the time, Count Dooku and General Grievous, conceived a trap aimed at taking out General Vale and fully regaining the initiative. The details surrounding their decisions were lost during the Confederate Council coup. However, we can infer their general intentions by examining the tactics employed by Admiral Duoningo and General Grievous in space and Count Poggle the Lesser on the surface. The political consequences were equally if not more important. Until Ryloth, the Republic has been on the defense and under siege all across the galaxy. There were questions in the Senate if the war could be won. Many systems were neutral to the point refusing to trade war-related materials to the Republic. Further, even after the raid on Coruscant and the bioweapon attack on Naboo, there were voices supporting the Confederacy, out of fear if not because they agreed with the separatist cause. After all, as far as anyone could see, the Sis was winning the war. Ryloth changed that perception and later Geonosis shattered it until Operations Deep Strike and Southern Star were launched as the two primary components of the biggest Confederate offensive since the war began. The most notable and direct consequence of the liberation and getting proof of the attempt to enslave the whole planet, combined with the outrage after Naboo, led to Corellia leaving their neutrality behind. While the Corellians didn't formally become a part of the GA, they allied themselves with the Republic for the duration of the conflict and put their considerable industrial and economic power on the armed forces' disposal. In the short term, the addition of Corellian naval units to the war effort was actually more important. Corellian ships would play key roles during Second Geonosis, the assault on Mandalore as well as Operations Southern Star and Deep Strike. Extract from History of the Clone Wars, Volume 2, The Road to Total War. Published by Anaxes Military Academy. The Lost Fleet. =RK=. Part 1. Conference Room. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Western Sector Fleet Flagship. Bespin. When the enemy is on the offensive, then days could be an eternity. It's worse when you were out of contact and left wondering what the crap was happening. With the whole Western Quadrant cut off from access to the rest of the Republic and the Holonet being jammed, there was not much that the commanders of the sector fleet units at Bespin could tell me besides the state of the enemy advance in the region. To my utter lack of surprise, the news were quite grim. I'm honestly surprised you managed to pass through Syria before the Clanker could secure it, sir. Rear Admiral Vex said. He was the clone in charge of all units at Bespin before my arrival to take command. We made a good time, Holt agreed. We left scouts behind at Lorta. They informed us that heavy enemy units entered the system 4 hours ago. So we've got a day at best to get your ships resupplied, General, Vex said after glancing at the map of the sector floating above the table we were all sitting at. While Nothoyan is still held by the rest of the fleet, Dollar should be under assault already and the Clankers should have dispatched a force to Gerentham to finish encircling our forces there. You mentioned a good news, Admiral? I asked. The positioning of both enemy and friendly forces was quite interesting. It's Eridau, sir. The clone smiled. While some of us had reservations about getting a newly promoted Rear Admiral in charge of the whole sector fleet, he proved us wrong, sir. Admiral Tennant is still holding Eridau itself along with its moon, however the outer and inner system are under enemy control. His last transmission indicates that at least a third of a separatist sector fleet along with the Confederacy's second fleet were assaulting his position. He's determined to hold them off for as long as possible. I nodded thoughtfully. If our intelligence is correct and the information you provided seems to indicate that's the case, we can expect almost half a sector fleet to converge on Gerentham in the next 48 hours. That's correct, sir. While the enemy has left light forces to cover the hyperlane junctions and bottle up any important planets we're holding, my staff estimates that approximately half the total separatist forces assaulting the quadrant are converging on Gerentham. Vex confirmed. How reliable are the locals there? What forces do they possess? Holt asked. A decent-sized defense navy and some fortifications, ma'am. We're talking about this sector's capital world. As for reliability, Vex shrugged. I can't say for sure. I would have preferred more time, Admiral Vex. At least a week. 2 would be better, however that was wishful thinking. The Freedom has some good simulators. I want all captains on board in the next 3 hours. We'll be practicing fleet operations until the resupply is done. We'll leave for Gerentham late so we can be there after the bulk of the enemy forces arrives. Have a messenger sent to Nothoyan. I want the rest of the fleet to join us there. The separatists believe that they can take this sector on the cheap and then send the bulk of their forces to more strategically important locations. We're going to prove them wrong. We'll destroy as many of their fleet at Gerentham, then move to Eridau, crushing anything standing in our way before kicking the enemy from that system too. Vex looked at the map and smiled coldly. While it was true that the local sector fleet simply lacked the numbers and firepower to meet everything the Sis was throwing their way, especially when their new love for ramming tactics were taken into account, the forces I brought were heavy on capital ships and the Freedom herself was powerful enough to crush a fleet by herself. My original plan was to resupply and get out of here as fast as possible. The fact that Tennant was still holding Eriadu and thus tying up a lot of enemy forces changed things. That his orders led to a full half of his original command waiting for me intact, that altered the strategic situation significantly. Even with half a sector fleet coming to the Gerantham, we were going to have a solid firepower if not numerical advantage. RK equals Jeddah Master Shark T's quarters, Tiboka City, Camino. This is the situation, Master T. Master Rancisis finished explaining everything that had happened on Coruscant. He had arrived mere hours before the Confederacy launched their offensive and practically cut off Camino from the Republic. The reinforcements he brought were going to be vital for holding the system once the enemy broke through the fleets defending the hyperlanes leading to Camino. However, the news Rancisis waited almost 2 weeks to share made T on edge. It didn't take her long to figure out why did he wait. Right now, the only way to contact Coruscant was to single powerful transmitter that had enough range to reach the core even with the holonet jammed and the place was under guard by a Cathar contingent brought by Master Rancisis. While welcomed, their presence has been a surprise for the Togruta, one that her fellow council member finally decided to dispel. The Jedi were planning a coup and she had been instrumental in persuading some of them that it was going to be necessary. Honestly, T wasn't sure what to think about that. While she was convinced that Vale was up to no good and was using the Republic as he used her, the Jedi Master had qualms with what the Council planned to do. T had been equally shocked and resigned when she heard of the way Master Teen's address to the Senate went. It made her think what led to such an outcome. She watched a recording of the debates multiple times and reached some unsettling conclusions. Speaking with some of the clones, who were simply put furious with her, made other things clear. The Jedi were failing in their duties to the people of the Republic. Oh, T knew that the Sith had a hand in shaping the public perception, making the Jedi's failing appear worse than they really were, something that made her even more furious with Vale. Please repeat that. I want to be sure I've understood the Council's instructions correctly. Shark T sighed and looked at Rancisis through narrowed eyes. We expect that Vale will head to Camino if we still hold this system after he fight his way through the Separatists in the Western Quadrant. When he arrives his forces will be depleted and he would likely be exhausted after utilizing battle meditation as often as he needs to. Once he arrives, you're to request a meeting so you can apologize for the troubles you've caused him. One in person here in Tiboka City. When he lands we'll engage him along with the forces I've brought. Rancisis explained. T closed her eyes. She could see the twisted logic. If she could control her emotions, she might be able to fool Vale. Might. In doing so, she would prove to all the clones who were under her command that they were right about her. About their mistrust of the Jedi. Even if they somehow managed to take Vale out, the army wasn't going to just accept such a betrayal. If there was one thing she was sure of, that was it. Win or lose, the Council's orders were a suicide. I see. Shark T whispered. By the Force, how things got so bad. I trust you'll do what's required of you, Master T? Rancisis asked. I'll do my duty. T nodded. She told him the truth too. Shark T just needed to figure out what her duty was and to whom. RK equals AN, map of the situation in the Western Quadrant. ib.co/cpgrmv equals RK equals. Part 2. Flag Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Gerantham System. A day of simulating training and a few hours of contingency planning for the battle we expected to fight were very far from enough to consider my new command to be combat ready. Simply throwing 2 fleets which hadn't trained for weeks into a single unit and expecting them to excel was folly, one I was forced to use anyway. That's why the plan we decided on was basic. We weren't going to use a combined fleet from the start. Vex's command was going to strike the Confederate forces coming from Isnaha while my own fleet was going to deal with the enemy contingent arriving from Jirok. Whichever group took care of their clankers first would assist the other. Once the system was secure, we would commence repairs, have a chat with the locals and decide what our next course of action would be. Ideally we might even be able to jump the force coming from Lauter, though that was mostly wishful thinking. Once they learned of our victory, and wasn't that a bit of wishful thinking too, those separatists would be pulling back the way they came if they knew what was good for them. The simulations were useful for something at least. Joanna hummed. The tactical display hovering in front of us was updating and the combined fleet was more or less where it was supposed to be. Mostly less, to be honest. I wasn't going to be pulling anything requiring too much precision with this force for the foreseeable future. It was a good thing that with the freedom here, good old-fashioned brute force was going to work splendidly. Yes. I nodded. We don't need to spend too long straightening up our formations. To be fair, both fleets, mine and Vex's, were individually deployed rather well after exiting hyperspace. The discrepancies could be seen only when comparing the rough positions of the two forces with what they should have been. "Sir, we're getting a feed from the scouts," Holtzade said. He, along with Piet, was acting as a third of our staff after Atrisia. "We're inputting the sensor data now," my own aide added. The plot shifted again. There was a lot of traffic in system, though most of it was busy scattering. Two large blobs of red symbols were advancing towards Gerantham after prudently jumping on the north and south edges of the system. There were flashing dots spreading in front of the enemy forces designating scouts searching for trouble. There were at least 100 ships, a third of them cruisers near the sector capital. They were in formation along with a lot of smaller unidentified contacts. It was a decent-sized force, however each of the separatists' task forces coming at them had more than enough ships and firepower to take them on and win. The plan's a go. Admiral Vex, you're taking on the southern force. We'll deal with their friends up north. Admiral Holt, we're going to test what we trained for while waiting for Crimson to raise its ugly head. You have tactical control of TF1. I'm moving my flag to the Remembrance and taking control of TF2. Have the insertion calculations ready by the time I arrive," I ordered. "Piet, you're with me?" "Aye, sir." My aide jumped to follow me. "May the force serve you well in the battle to come, Admiral Holt." I nodded at the Corellian woman and headed to the nearest hangar. Finding both enemy forces in system and approaching the capital cautiously was less than ideal. We waited a bit longer before heading this way, hoping that they would be deeper in the system, preferably engaging the locals when we arrived, though we could work with this too. It just meant that the enemy had better odds at salvaging more of its forces. =Ashe equals CIC, Mandalorian Cruiser Remembrance. 2 light hours from Gerantham. While Vex's fleet wasn't ready to execute any complicated tactical move along with my own forces, I actually had some time to drill my fleet before heading for Atrisia. While the hit the chain of command took thanks to Crimson was very bad, I had the captains gathered on the Freedom for most of our time in the unknown regions and we got busy in the simulators. It paid off. The fleet divided in 2 groups centered around the Freedom and my silencer-equipped cruiser before jumping at the northern force. We emerged at the enemy's flanks and began moving in opposite directions. Thanks to having the Freedom, Holt's TF-1 was heading towards the enemy's front, where they could concentrate most of their firepower, while my own TF-2 was going to sling along, wrecking everything in range before turning to hit the Confederate formation from behind. If we had more of the senior command staff from before Atrisia, I would have had 2 more task forces hitting the enemy from above and below. "Captain, fire at will. Concentrate on their light ships. Beware ramming attempts. Launch fighters and keep them as cap," I ordered. The Remembrance was commanded by one of the clones under Trick he recommended before leaving to get the next 2 silencer-equipped cruisers to Palion at Mandalore before we headed for Atrisia. His name was Kilo, and from what I saw during the simulations, he had a decent head for tactics on his shoulder even if he lacked experience. "Silencer is charged," Piet announced from his station behind me. "Fire once you have the maximum number of targets locked in." I smiled. It's been too long since I've seen that weapon deployed. To their credit, whoever was in charge of the Confederate fleet reacted fast. The first salvos just went in when the CIS fleet accelerated in attempt to get away from the killing ground formed between my 2 task forces. Unfortunately for them, Holt was accelerating parallel to their course and unleashing hell upon them as she overtook the enemy formation. "Targets locked in, firing," Piet exclaimed. 12 intact munificence vanished from the tactical display. Keep the silencer covered while it recharges, I advised. Have the TF move 10 degrees to starboard, 5 degrees down, I added after watching the enemy react. Swarms of vultures were already launching and attempting to close with us. Fortunately, the enemy didn't wait until they were all out and threw them in on big group. Instead they came piecemeal, and most of them were devoured by the Guardian, Cap and our own frigates, which were all concentrated on the starboard side of my formation. That enemy action was understandable. They were losing a lot of munificence fast, and if they didn't get their vultures off ASAP and sent our way, they were going to get blown up for no gain. This way, the droid fighters were going to at least cost us some of our own and at least soften up, if not take out some frigates too. Needless to say, the enemy wasn't faring particularly good, especially on their other flank. The Freedom could unleash half her weapon at anything coming into range, and only the battleships could survive such concentrated firepower for more than a few seconds. The munificence that ran afoul of the Corellian ship simply blew up after the first salvo that made contact with them. Even better, for the first couple of minutes, the Freedom drew the fire of everything that could target her, and her shields didn't even waver. Before the Confederate commander could comprehend what was happening over there and change targeting priorities, that whole flank was being systematically shattered, and Holt wasn't going to give them a chance to reform. Things on my end weren't going as well, which was as expected. While my TF2 was actually larger, even with the silencer we had at most a third of the firepower Joanna could throw at the enemy. The Freedom made that much of a difference. Good work, weapons. Now target that munificent division trying to pull up. The captain ordered. The silencer is almost charged, Captain, Piet reported. Get us 5 more degrees to the starboard and target that battleship. Have our division concentrate fire on it after the silencer hits it. Once it's disabled, continue targeting the munificence, Kilo ordered. It was a good call. We were almost past the enemy formation, and that Le Crieuc was one of the last things that might slow us down while we completed our turn and could take the Cis fleet from behind. I called both sensor and optical feed in front of me to watch how the silencer was going to perform against a battleship. It already proved itself against the munificence, and it was going to be a great tool in neutralizing the numerical advantage the enemy usually enjoyed. If it was reasonably effective against modern battle wagons too, it was going to be even better. Weapon clear. Target locked. Firing. Piet announced. 10 crimson beams flashed from the hangar bay and struck the Le Crieuc at the same time. For a brief moment its shield blazed as it struggled to stop the incoming firepower, then it failed at the points of contact and the diminished energy lances struck the ship itself. Armor simply detonated and took everything around with itself. While the battleship was still operational and the damage it suffered was concentrated in the areas struck by the silencer, its shields were depleted. The first salvo that hit it afterward popped them. The next slammed in the exposed hull as my ships began dismantling the Le Crieuc. Yet even as it was dying, it spat back its defiance. A CL-90 was unfortunate enough to run straight into the return fire and simply vanished, and it was soon followed by a light cruiser that broke in two after mere seconds of bombardment. Meanwhile, the enemy vultures had concentrated their remaining numbers, and the Cis commander chose to throw them all at the Freedom in a last-ditch attempt to cripple her. Despite everything Holt managed to throw their way, the range was too low and the droid fighters managed to break through. Those that lived long enough to do so might have been enough to cripple a smaller, more lightly armored ship. However, the Freedom had been built to survive a tremendous amount of punishment even after her shields failed. All the vultures could achieve was to disable some sensor clusters and weapon emplacements, and with a single notable exception, all of those were either secondary guns or Guardian clusters. The Remembrance's division finished off the Le Crieuc it was targeting, and my TF was completing its turn when the Confederate commander had enough. The enemy fleet broke and dispersed, with ships fleeing in hyperspace as fast as they could. Limited pursuit is authorized. Concentrate on disabling enemy hyperdrives. The moment they are all gone, resume offensive formation and have nav coordinates locked to Admiral Vex's force, I ordered. Seeing the enemy force simply break was beautiful. To be honest, it wasn't something I expected by a Confederacy force. Given the expendable nature of their crews and lighter ships, they were usually content with accepting losses that would shatter the morale of a traditional navy. To a lesser extent, the same was true for the clone crewed and commanded units of the GAR. In the right circumstances, such a trait could be a great boon. However, it sometimes led to losses that could be otherwise avoided. RK equals CIC, Republic Cruiser for Honor. 3 light hours from Gerentham. Admiral Vex didn't attempt anything fancy. While the enemy outnumbered his forces, he was most certainly not outgunned, and the fleet units from Nuthoyan should be arriving shortly. That's why he chose to meet the enemy head-on. He was going to concentrate their attention on his fleet, and when the time came close, and to deny them an easy escape in hyperspace. Vex ordered all fighters and bombers launched after his fleet reverted back to real space, and ordered the later to move to the back of the fleet. He was going to keep them in reserve until the enemy force was broken and tried to flee. The torrents, on the other hand, were going to aid the frigates and guardians in fending off the separatists' vultures. We've got targeting solutions across the fleet. One of the clones making up the Admiral's staff reported. Fire at will. The targeting priority stands. Vex ordered. Blue and red turbo laser bolts criss-crossed through space and ships began dying. The escorts took the brunt of the casualties during the initial engagement. CR-90 and light cruisers were dying almost as fast as the enemy was losing munificence. Tens of thousands of vultures threw themselves against Vex's fleet and were met by torrents with missile and laser fire after the Guardian missiles softened them up. Whole squadrons of droid fighters were vanishing as they raced through the distance between the fleets. Then they slammed into a wall of fire when the CR-90s and the Guardians began engaging them with their AA guns. Some broke through only to be jumped on by torrents left in reserve. To Vex it looked like someone was launching fireworks around his leading ships as hundreds of fighters dueled while shot at by the Guardian. The Admiral felt relief when the vultures failed to do more than lightly damage a pair of Vinotas and a single acclimator before being mopped up. One of his fears was that the clankers had found a way to negate the Guardian, in which case the huge number of droid fighters they had could have been decisive. With the vulture threat handled, Vex could concentrate all his attention on the fleet engagement. The enemy had decided that they were losing too many munificence and the frigates were peeling off to go to the flanks, and their battle line was advancing. Now things were going to get really ugly as more and more battleships were getting into effective range. Begin targeting the Lucree hulks. I want multiple cruiser and assault ship divisions to concentrate fire on a single battleship. Vex ordered. Enough firepower to shatter continents was concentrated on single capital ships. It was slow and hard, yet they began to die. Acclimators were turned into floating coffins. Vinotas began falling out of formation if lucky, or simply shattering when 2 or more Lucree hulks concentrated on them. The battleships didn't go unscratched either. One after another they began to lose shields and were racked by the Republic's furious response. Suddenly the enemy formation broke. Their remaining munificence charged Vex's fleet at ramming vectors, while the battleships went to go around his fleet. Admiral, General Vale has defeated the enemy northern force and will be arriving to assist us in 2 minutes. A staff member announced. That explains it. Begin independent maneuvering. Escorts, keep those munificence off our backs. The fleet is to disperse and block those battleships from escaping. Vex ordered. For the next few minutes the battle turned into chaotic melee as the enemy fleet attempted to disengage. There were no formations, just pure chaos as the two forces continued to tear each other apart. Vale's arrival should have broken the enemy, however the Republic's luck ran out. A minute after the general engaged the southern force and began reducing it in earnest, the Confederate fleet from Lutrilia arrived and joined the melee. The chaos grew further when the forces from Nuthoyan finally arrived and the locals decided to head for the giant furball too. All Vex could do at that moment was to watch and pray. There was no commanding such madness. Suddenly things changed. The very idea that the Republic could lose the battle vanished from Vex's mind. He knew that victory was at hand. Knew what his ships were about to do, even if proper communication was all but impossible thanks to the jamming and ECM thrown around by everyone. All he had to do was command the few ships close enough for comms to work, because he was somehow aware what everyone else in the Republic fleet and the system was doing. It was time to end this madness. Turn us 20 degrees to port. Half speed. Concentrate fire to the starboard. Vex began issuing orders in earnest. The Republic was going to win. He was certain of it.